All right, Matt Brown is a fantastic national correspondent over at the Washington Post. This man's going to educate us on everything that's happening with former President Trump, specifically in the state of Georgia, and he joins us here on the show. Matt, Mike and Leon, Nick Savary, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Thanks, guys. Great to be here.
Matt, I want to ask you at the top because in prepping to have you on the program, I was reading some of your articles, obviously, of everything that's happened in Georgia. We're going to get into that in a second. But a few weeks back, you and a couple of your colleagues wrote this article. The header was funny. The status of key investigations involving Donald Trump. From local, state, and now federal investigations, this is happening across multiple agencies with the former president that he's involved in legal battles. Can you summarize 30,000-foot view for our audience where we are with some of these investigations at a real high level for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing to understand about a lot of the different Trump investigations going on is I basically put them into two buckets here. One bucket that I would say would be the investigations that you're looking at with Trump, where he was, because he was president and because he was a very high profile public figure who he'd been a celebrity for obviously decades in American life and everything, but not everyone was necessarily scrutinizing his businesses, his charitable contributions, and just everything that he'd been doing in that time. But then obviously once you become president and you have a lot more consequence in American life than even you did as the host of Celebrity Apprentice, that's when you start to get, local district attorneys, attorney generals of states, and just investigators, prosecutors who are going to be interested in the conduct of these businesses and how they were actually conducting themselves. So these are the investigations that you've seen in, for instance, Washington, D.C., where the Trump organization has had some operations, and also New York, where Trump is obviously from, where these investigations have been scrutinizing his business practices, whether it's at the Manhattan District Attorney or the New York Attorney General, basically saying what has actually been going on here with your business properties, your valuations, and that could lead to seeing potentially the Trump organization or Trump's other enterprises being fined or facing other liabilities for things like tax fraud or tax avoidance or distortion evaluation of properties and everything. So that's that category that because Trump basically became president and people were paying a little bit more attention to all of his many assets in the US and around the world, folks basically said, well, actually, what is going on here with all of these things now that they're so much more high profile and that they're actually entangled not just with his own personal brand and everything, but also with just the actual apparatus of the federal government and the prestige of the White House. The second category of things that we're looking at are the more criminal, serious things going on here, that's with the Department of Justice's investigations into the improper taking of documents at Mar-a-Lago and whether or not he had human classified intelligence, which is basically just information that spies had acquired for the United States. Whether he'd improperly taken documents that weren't supposedly classified. This is the dispute that we've been seeing in the past couple of weeks. And then also things like, what was his involvement with January 6th and what was his involvement at the federal level with attempting to overturn America's elections and contribute to an insurrection that saw the Capitol stormed by, a mob of his supporters. And that actually culminates to what I've been paying most attention to, as you said in my reporting, which has been what's going on down here in Georgia, which actually faces potentially the most significant criminal investigation into Trump and his allies, which is the efforts to overturn or affect or delay the election results here in Georgia, where Trump was clearly had pressured, as we reported at the Washington Post and many others elsewhere did as well, that he directly pressured the Secretary of State, the governor, state legislatures, and many conservative activists and members of his inner circle had openly spread conspiracy theories and misinformation about Georgia's elections and caused a lot of chaos down here about what was actually going on in Georgia. And that process, that effort, that pressure campaign has now drawn the attention of Atlanta's district attorney, as well as many, other investigative bodies down here in Georgia, as well as, from outside of the state, even as well as we've seen in recent weeks. So those are the two buckets there, the things that are improper, but might be even civil in nature on the Trump organization side. And then the things that are genuinely criminal and have much more to do with his political ambitions and his efforts to overturn the 2020 election that present much more, present and dangerous, criminal potential consequences for Trump should they come to a full prosecution.
Matt, we had on a former federal prosecutor recently, and we had listed for him just the various legal battles that the former president is taking on, and we asked him, "What's the one that, if you're a lawyer for Trump, that should be keeping you up at night?" And he pointed to Georgia. Matt, just take us through, because we're hearing obviously a lot of names that are being mentioned. Obviously, Lindsey Graham, former president, Rudy Giuliani, folks that are being either asked to testify or their names are being brought up in this trial. What's at stake for the former president, but also B, why is this case is something we should all be paying more attention to nationally, and what's on the line for the former president?
Right, definitely. So one thing to just give a little bit of context here about Georgia is that obviously Georgia has been no stranger for a very long time for debates about voting, debates about election fraud, debates over who's tampering the ballots, who has access to ballots. Like this was the state that had some of the most consequential fights over voting rights during the civil rights movement, and debates over voter fraud and who has access to the ballot has been very significant there here ever since. And I bring that up to say that is as a consequence of that history. Georgia has exceptionally stringent laws with criminal consequences for delaying the administration of elections and pressuring election officials around elections and everything. So other states have stringent regulations around this, but Georgia's laws are very, very explicit about that you can face very steep criminal consequences for interfering with elections, pressuring people to interfere with elections. And then separately, because Georgia also has very strong anti-racketeering laws on the books as well that have been used very liberally in this state to prosecute gangs, to prosecute human trafficking here in Atlanta. That has also been novelly used actually even to prosecute teachers. Georgia's laws are just very, very set and very, very ripe for a case like this, where there was a coordinated conspiracy by Trump and his allies potentially to overturn the results of the 2020 election. So whereas you saw this happen all across the country, locally, it's very clear under Georgia law that we could have seen at least 3 laws, as I just outlined. It's criminal for a person to delay the administration of election, even if they didn't actually delay the election successfully. It's actually just not allowed for them to be pressuring people to be delaying that actual process. That itself is illegal down here. Number 2, it's illegal to solicit people to commit election fraud down here. Now that gets into the intent of a person's mind and whether or not they actually really meant to commit election fraud. And that's when you get into the questions around when Trump was calling Brad Raffensperger and he was saying, I just want you to find 11,000 votes. When Lindsey Graham was calling Brad Raffensperger twice and said, I think that, there's just got to be something with your absentee ballot policies. Well, that's when you get into questions around, well, what was their intent? What were they really thinking about when it comes to these questions? When Rudy Giuliani was testifying to the Georgia State Legislature that he had ironclad evidence of voter fraud at the State Farm Arena here in Atlanta, was he sure that that was a lie and that he really didn't think that that was true and that he's just saying that to muddy the waters, delay the election? That might not matter for the first count that I brought up, but it would, the much more stringent second count that would be far more serious, you do actually have to get into whether or not a person really understood that what they were saying was not true or not. And then the third part, which is a bit novel here, that District Attorney Fani Willis has been using in this case, has been the RICO laws here in Georgia that say that because the Trump organization, the Trump White House, the Trump campaign were coordinating here to potentially delay or overturn the results of the election, as the district attorney is arguing, that itself could be a very, very stringent criminal liability here, which is why you've seen, just today, John Eastman, who was the lawyer who gave the 6-page memo that argued that Mike Pence was able to contest the election results on January 6th, why a lot of other members of Trump's legal team, like Kenneth Chesebro, Jenna Ellis, Jackie Pick-Deason, Cleta Mitchell, why all of them were also subpoenaed in this, because they were potentially part of a much broader conspiracy. And that seems to be the argument that this district attorney and her special grand jury are zeroing in on, especially as we've come to the end of the summer and see who they're really going after here at this point.
Matt, just to follow up to that, you just mentioned a couple of examples of members of Trump's team that have been directly in contact with the state. We're all familiar with transcript, like what the former president had said. On face value, does that seem to be the key piece of evidence that the prosecution is trying to bring to bear, or just basically putting out there as reason enough to say that there's a violation of laws? And at the same time, Is simply making that request, as we've seen done by multiple people on Trump's team, is that enough to be in violation of the law?
So what we've heard, so the thing that started this entire investigation, and District Attorney Willis was very clear about that, was the Washington Post report that found the hour-long call of Trump pressuring Brad Raffensperger to, potentially overturn the election or "quote unquote" find votes for Trump. That is what she explicitly said when she launched this investigation before the special grand jury, like right after January 6th in January 2021. That's what she said, "I'm interested in now investigating." So given that that's the origin of it, it's seems likely and logical that she believes that laws were clearly broken there. That said, though, like everything that we've learned this summer since the special grand jury has been seated, and since she's been trying to subpoena and harangue and get a lot of these other members of Trump world, people like Governor Brian Kemp, who were potentially victims of this plot, those people, though, shows that they have really expanded this. Like for instance, one thing that I think has been interesting is the fact that the slate of GOP alternate electors who were subpoenaed in this criminal probe, they were told that they were targets of the investigation, which isn't saying that we're going to necessarily bring prosecution against you, but it's saying that we think we have enough evidence to think that you all broke laws. The fact that Willis brought that information to the alternate slate of electors who directly were not, they, to our knowledge in public reporting, didn't necessarily also pressure people behind the scenes. But the fact that Willis does think that something could have happened there, or that she has sufficient enough information to show that they could have also broken laws, either by attempting to forge and certify, a fake slate of electors in December 2020, or by thereby, working behind the scenes with things that we don't know that are publicly available at the moment. It shows that she thinks that this is a much broader conspiracy than just what we publicly knew at the time in January and in January 2021, which was, I just think it's like important also just step back and just remember that this was a really crazy time. A lot of things were happening in the country. December 2020 was just every single day that some other crazy text was coming out, or someone was muddying the waters here, and then something was coming out of Wisconsin, something was going on in Arizona. There was a lot of people were saying a lot of things that seemed very out of pocket and not properly organized. And I think that we were very blinded about that in the moment to the fact that potentially laws could have been broken here. And it's only after the fact, nearly 2 years later, as we look back at everything that was said, everything that was done, everything that was scrambled to be executed in Trump's orbit, that we realize how coordinated this conspiracy was at times, and then also how potentially laws could have been broken here, which is basically what in a lot of these investigations from the local to the federal level, that's the thing that people are really just trying to untangle here with the entire Jan 6 story.
Matt, I want to ask you, staying in Georgia, where you are and covering all the politics that you are, you wrote an article about, Governor Kemp right now not having to testify until after the election. Obviously, he's got a big election this fall against Stacey Abrams. Can you take our audience a little bit inside the decision to delay Governor Kemp after? And what are you also hearing from Georgia voters about his potential, testifying during this process? Does that affect any voters one way or the other?
Yeah, so Brian Kemp was one of the first people who Willis definitely seemed like she wanted to hear from, given that we know that Trump and his allies and people in Kemp's orbit even had been saying, you need to hold a special session, you need to at least investigate this, you need to show that you're on the president's side in this quest to win the 2020 election, even after Joe Biden had been declared the victor. So because of that, we've been seeing since the special grand jury, which has subpoena power, had been seated in May of this year, we'd thought that at some point Kemp was going to testify before the grand jury, just like Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and Attorney General Chris Carr, who were both Republicans and who'd both also been pressured by Trump. We assumed that Kemp was going to be like them and also appear here. Willis had allowed Kemp to delay his testimony during the primary, which had been a very fraught time in the GOP, where former Senator David Perdue had been clearly attacking Kemp over not taking action. So the issue at hand in the special grand jury had actually been the question of the GOP primary. Like that had been what Kemp was fighting over. So Willis said, all right, fine, like I will delay your testimony to not interfere in the politics of this. And that is something that she did of her own, agreed of her own volition in the case. Afterwards, though, we thought that Kemp was going to provide sworn testimony or some kind of statement or some kind of video interview to the special grand jury in late July. That it came out in this month that actually never happened, and that Kemp's lawyers and the investigators in the district attorney's office had a serious breakdown of communication, and they were, very much not communicating properly. Kemp's lawyers basically wanted there to be certain protections around what could be asked of Kemp, and they didn't want anything to leak out because they were very scared of that potentially happening. Willis's attorneys said basically, no, like, we need to be able to ask you about any and everything, and we don't care that you've given us over a whole bunch of documents, most of which are basically useless to us in this investigation. We really want to ask you directly some questions about what Trump was likely pressuring you to. That seems to be the line of inquiry that they were following. We know all of this from emails and deposition that Kemp's lawyers actually provided to the court, which showed some really explosive language there. It showed to me that Kemp is very, very nervous about his reelection prospects, and more specifically, how this case can interact with his reelection prospects. He has been very clearly marketing himself as a strident and unapologetic, Georgia conservative, but he's just not in necessarily Trump's wing of the party. But he has passed, significant amounts of, conservative policy in the state over the past couple of years. He passed a permitless carry bill, which means that you don't need a permit anymore to carry a firearm in Georgia. He's, cut taxes here. He has, targeted the teaching of, race and history in history classes in Georgia, has, expanded, expanded religious liberties in the state, passed a, abortion ban. This is a very, very conservative governor. He is scared, though, that in a state that has like such thin margins for, re-election here, that any group of, Trump supporters who are then reminded that Trump does not like Kemp and Trump doesn't want Kemp to win again. He's terrified that anything that could possibly create the optics of that would make it so that he would not win re-election. That seems to have been basically the argument that his lawyers were making, where they said, first, they've made the argument that they have sovereign immunity and that Kemp is legally protected from having to testify because he is the sovereign legally in the state. That didn't necessarily really fly with McBurney, who basically said, well, that doesn't really make sense in the context of this case, especially because sovereign immunity usually only applies to civil cases, and this is definitely a criminal investigation. And in the courtroom, there was a bit of fireworks about this back and forth over what actually power the special grand jury has. Their second argument also didn't really fly because it was basically saying that Kemp has executive privilege, which McBurney, the judge who oversees the case, pointed out as a federal power that the president normally only has. And he said, are you trying to say that somewhere in the Georgia Constitution, we also give you executive privilege powers? And they had to concede, no, that's not the case. So what McBurney basically said is, I don't take your first two arguments that there is any legal reason why you shouldn't be able to testify in this, and why Willis's attorneys shouldn't be able to hear from you. What he did take seriously was their third argument, which is that because of the political optics of this, because of the political explosive nature of this, there's no reason why he can't testify until after the election, just because of the, quote, political impact. He didn't really take seriously any of Kemp's lawyers' arguments that the investigation was somehow political itself, or that Willis was, in the tank for Stacey Abrams, but he did take seriously the idea that the optics of this case are already so fraught and inherently political that he didn't want to disrupt the political processes as they were taking out. He's been, and I want to note that the judge who's been overseeing this has been very, very judicious in saying that I don't even want anything that like smells remotely political touching this case. So this is very, very in line with some other past rulings that we've seen throughout the summer from him. That case seems to somewhat frustrate, District Attorney Willis. She said this week that she believes that people who have information in the investigation should testify, which seemed to be a way of her saying, I think that he should testify now, but I'll take him testifying after the investigation. But for Kemp, it's already become a political situation now. Like Stacey Abrams has been, posting, attack ads on Kemp, basically implying that he has something to hide because he doesn't want to testify in this anymore, which honestly actually gets the legal question entirely backwards. Kemp was being pressured by Trump to overturn the election, and he didn't. And the optics of that for Kemp are very politically bad for him in a conservative base that's still very loyal to Trump. The issue for Kemp now, though, is that he might honestly, for some swing voters, then look like he's being more loyal to Trump than they'd be comfortable with. And that's been something that I've been exploring down here and trying to figure out who are the people who could actually be moved by this case. It's a relatively small number of people, but in a state that where only a couple thousand votes can actually flip an entire election, the question of, is Kemp, a strong ally of Donald Trump, or is he avoiding him? Honestly, that could move equal numbers of people in either direction. And it's going to be really interesting to see which one eventually wins out through all the rest of the noise of what's going on in this governor's race.
Now, you can make an argument that the segment of people you're talking about is seemingly a microcosm of what we're seeing in other parts of the country. Between the Senate race with Ron Johnson, Wisconsin. I live in Pennsylvania, so we're seeing it being played out between the race between John Fetterman and Dr. Oz. Matt, just expanding on that, when you think of that margin for votes, and Georgia is especially fascinating because you've got obviously Herschel Walker, taking on the incumbent, Reverend Raphael Warnock. How do you expand on that margin, and where does the temperature seem to be swinging for folks who either are just sort of either where they are with the Trump noise, but also what seems to be a more united and a clear message coming in from Democrats, especially over the last month, and what we're seeing play out in elections across the country?
Yeah, so if the polls are to be believed, I think that we're seeing an interesting split here in Georgia, where like I said, Kemp is a very conservative governor. He's also, in my opinion, very, very Georgia. Like, this is a guy who he's been a conservative. He was essentially part of some of his history in the state is that he was part of this wing of this wave of young conservative lawmakers who entered the Georgia state legislature back in the 2000s. And that was before he became Secretary of State and then governor. So he's been a very known quantity in the state for a very long time. He's championed very conservative policies for a very long time. And I think that that's what actually helped him, survive just these relentless attacks from Trump and his allies and lead him to basically being, I'm going to be able to weather this and show that it doesn't really, I'm the real deal, basically. And that I'm not going to, you can go Reno hunting somewhere else. Like, I'm the real deal conservative down here, and I'm a true son of Georgia, which is when I go around the state and I really talk to people in a lot of these communities that usually vote heavily Republican. That's what people will basically say. Well, they'll say, I think something happened in the 2020 election. I'm mad at Kemp about that. I'm mad at Raffensperger about that. But they are good men, and I will still support them. Which is why I think that in that context, especially for incumbents, you are seeing Raffensperger and Kemp still up in the polls, even as the environment has improved for Democrats. That is not the same that is not the same thing that's happening for Herschel Walker, who is down in the polls against Raphael Warnock. He's also a challenger, and this seems to be, shaping up to be just like a not very good year for challengers here in Georgia. But him challenging Raphael Warnock, who's really tried to show that he is a representative for all of Georgia, that he is championing policies that are going to benefit Georgians no matter what part of the state they're in, which is a very important issue in a state that has such regional inequality like Georgia. That has been, he's also just like, to be honest, like, he's had a ton of just crazy gaffes where he's said things that haven't made sense to people. There's a lot of attack ads that have been very damaging to him here in the state. So while, the core Trump base here in the state might be a little turned off by, Kemp not necessarily going with Trump all the time, they're eventually going to come home, it seems. That same base, though, while they're really, really riled up by Herschel Walker, while they're really, really riled up by some other folks on the ticket like Burt Jones, they're not necessarily a big enough coalition to go and win the rest of the state. A lot of people in Metro Atlanta, a lot of people in, some of the other like cities in the state, like, Columbus and Augusta, around Savannah, those folks who are usually amenable to being able to vote conservative, they're looking at the current state of the GOP and they're saying, I don't know that this is my party. Like, I'm a strident Georgia conservative, but I don't feel like this Trump movement is really representing me, or that I feel that comfortable with it. And like I said, Georgia is emblematic of our political divides in this country right now, both on on the geography, on the demographics, and as a result of that, it's a super polarized state. Like, no matter who wins these elections, it's going to be incredibly close. And as a result of that, I think it's really important to note that these small margins of people who say, I might stick by Kemp, as the polls are currently showing, they might also be able to say, I also have thought that Raphael Warnock did, a decent enough job, in the Senate. I didn't turn out for Kelly Loeffler, David Perdue the first time, and I might be willing to, give Raphael Warnock another chance and everything. On the point of Stacey Abrams and the rest of the challengers on the Democratic side, their situation has definitely improved over the past couple of weeks, as we've seen, for instance, the effects of the overturning of Roe versus Wade, the motivation of the Democratic base, and a lot of passing of legislation by President Biden in Congress. That has shown that there is increased movement and organizing here. And as someone who covers voting rights and election administration, I also do have to say that the voter registration in Georgia right now is potentially showing things that the polls aren't picking up. Like these campaigns are going into places and registering people who might not normally vote. We're seeing a huge shift in the number of women who are getting registered to vote. And that gender gap in Georgia could just be enough to swing the election, especially given that we know that women are much more Democratic than men at the moment in the country. So those certain factors might be things that the polls aren't necessarily picking up at the moment. But the current archetypal voter in Georgia seems to be this archetypal swing voter, seems to be a person who probably lives in Metro Atlanta, who could be amenable to voting for some of the conservative incumbents. They say, well, you haven't driven the state into the ground, at least from my perspective. And but I'm also going to stick by at the federal level with my Democratic congressman and my Democratic senator. That seems to be where we're basically trending for in Georgia at the moment. But there is still a lot of time before November. And as I've said, people are organizing on the ground here very aggressively.
It's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out, not only in your state, but in a bunch of different races. I'm in the state of Florida, and we're going to see what happens in the governor's race here with Governor DeSantis and Charlie Crist. Matthew Brown is a fantastic national correspondent over at the Washington Post. He obviously knows everything about the state of Georgia. So if you're informed, follow him on social media. Anything related to the state of Georgia, he's got you covered on that front. Matt, I can't thank you enough for coming on the program today. Continued success to you, sir, and please stay safe.
Appreciate y'all. Thanks.
Our show is brought to you by the good folks at Fresh Roasted Coffee, freshroastedcoffee.com since 2009, making quality coffee at an amazing, affordable price. Hit the link right now in our episode description, and you can get a discount on this amazing coffee for being a listener and watcher of Can We Please Talk.